So now we've come to one of the most important, critical questions. How do we build the strength and integrity of an individual's self-esteem? Someone in our team, or even a new employee? Well, perhaps the best way to explain how to do this is explain how someone actually helped me in my own career. About 20 years ago, I joined a large American oil and gas company as an engineer. I was offered an opportunity to take a mid-level sales management role. Now initially I was really sceptical. I mean, what do I know about sales and management? I was 30 years old, I'd only ever worked in construction or engineering, and on top of that I was actually asked to permanently move across to the Middle East. In the end, and after much deliberation, I decided to take the job, and in hindsight I'm eternally grateful that I did. But I did not do it so much because of what I learned about being a great manager, but much more because of the individual that I actually went to work for. You see, he was an individual who was what I would like to call a conscious, competent leader, who understood precisely what we're talking about today and been talking about over the last few weeks. He taught me how to take responsibility for helping me look at my own strengths and weaknesses, and showed up on how to grow and develop me in a way that I never even thought was possible. Anyway, my new boss, he was the VP of Sales and Marketing, and I remember the first day on the job, and he asked me to come into his office, and I'm sitting in his office, and he got a pot of nice coffee, and he poured both of us a coffee and he put it down in front of me, and he looked at me and he said, "James, I want you to understand something." He said, "You've just joined a Premier League outfit here. We are a top championship team." So, think about it. I have literally, seconds in my role, and he has already had me, looking at the vision. He's raising my expectations. He's telling me we are a Premier League outfit. He's planting the vision in my mind of who this team actually was. And as we all know, vision is one of the critical leadership tools and the first cornerstone of motivational intelligence. So he looked at me and he says, "If you're going to be part of this team, James, you must be a championship caliber player." He says, "Now, James, you may not be a caliber player right now. However, I can see your potential of becoming one." And I remember I looked at him and I was a bit confused. I said, "How do I become a championship player? I'm new in the role. I've never done sales and marketing before. I'm an engineer." I'm thinking, oh. And he looked at me and he says, "James," he says, "I don't know how you're going to become one." He says, "But I don't know how I became one." And he says, "I know how scores of other people before you have become one." He says, "You know something, James?" He says, "I need you to make a choice right here today. Before you leave the office." He says, "Before you approach your new sales and management career," he says, "you have two key choices." He said, "Choice number one is you can do it your way." He says, "Now, if you do it your way, it's a blank canvas, James. You can come and you can go as you please. You can set your own schedule." He said, "But I'll tell you this," he says, "you're going to have a really steep, really long learning curve." He said, "You're probably going to make a lot of mistakes over a much longer extended period of time. And that's okay." He says, "And because of that," he says, "there's a pretty high likelihood that if you take a long time to master this sales and marketing process, there's a pretty high risk that you're probably going to burn out, because this is a high-paced, high-stakes environment." And I'm kind of thinking, I said, okay. So tell me, what's my other choice? What other choices do I have? What's my other option? And then he said, "Okay." He says, "Your second option is this." He says, "You can do it our way." He says, "Now, this way, it's a proven pathway. It's the one that I followed, and it's the one that scores of other people have followed before you. Now," he says, "James, you're still going to have quite a steep learning curve." He says, "but it'll be shorter." He says, "You're still going to make mistakes, but you'll make less of them. And because of that," He says you become a much more successful sooner. He says, and as long as you stay on the pathway, he said, you will be destined to become a championship caliber sales manager. And I remember looking at him and I'm looking at him straight and I said, okay, we'll do it your way. I think we should do it your way. So he stood up and he comes over and he shook my hand and he says, fantastic, great decision, James. And then he looks at me again and he says, James, I need you to recognise something. He says, to be the best of the best in the business, you cannot leave anything to chance. He goes across his desk and he opens his desk and he handed me this 40-page sales script and he said, when you get into your first sales call, you've got to know precisely what you're going to say, why you're going to say it and when you're going to say it. And I remember looking at this script, you know, an inch thick and my eyes are bulging out my head and I remember thinking, like, how the hell am I going to remember this? There's no way I can memorise all that. I mean, it's not even my words. And I kind of looked at him and I was feeling a bit disheartened and I said, look, I'm not sure I understand why I need to memorise this full sales script. You know, they're not my words and I don't want them to sound scripted and come across all rehearsed, you know. I don't want to sound like one of those salespeople that come on the phone and you can tell they're reading from a script. That's not who I am. I don't want that to be me. And he looked at me and he asked, James, he says, do you ever go to the movies? And I said, absolutely. I said, I absolutely love going to the movies. He says, have you ever seen Al Pacino, you know, deliver a really passionate speech in one of his movies? And I went, yeah, of course I have, you know, it's incredible to watch him. And then he continued, he says, Pacino, he says, when he was giving that speech in the movie, he says, did he make it up? Or we use a script just like this one here? Oh yeah, he says, probably a script. When a top actor repeats a script, he says, does it sound canned, James? Does it sound scripted or rehearsed? No, it doesn't. Why? He says, Pacino, he's taken that script and he's learned the words so well that he isn't even thinking about them anymore. He knows exactly what to say. He says, and it just flows. And he continues, he says, James, I just want you to take the script with you and practice this as often as you can. That way, when you need it, or someone asks you about the products or services, the answer will just flow. That's why learning the script is so important. So anyways, I goes away and I'm practicing this presentation, and you know, every spare minute I had, you know, every time I was closing the office door, during lunch, you know, I was practicing it in the mirror, I was practicing it in front of the dog. Literally any time I had spare time, I had this script out and I was practicing and practicing and practicing. And after a few weeks at practice, it actually started to click in my head and I kind of got it. Anyway, I think it was 2 or 3 weeks later, and I went back into Alistair's office and said, Alistair, I think I've got it. I think I know the script. I think I've mastered it. And he said, great. He says, that's fantastic, James. He says, I've actually arranged a couple of presentations for this next week with a couple of local engineering companies. He says, so be prepared, get yourself ready as you're going to be presenting. And I'm thinking, oh dear. So anyway, build the presentation, I had the script. So anyway, the following week, Alistair came into my office and says, right, James, grab your stuff and make sure you've got your presentation on a flash drive. We're going to do a presentation today. And I was just like, whoa. Anyways, off we went to our first appointment, and on the way there I was getting really nervous. You know, I was presenting for the first time in front of my boss, and not just any boss, he was a sales and marketing VP. You know, I was starting to get quite panicky and nervous. So anyways, we get out of the car, we walked up to the reception of the office. A few minutes later, you know, we get our passes. This man walks out, he introduces himself, he shakes our hands and he says, come follow me. And he takes us through into this kind of really fancy boardroom, you know, one of those big oak boardrooms. There's 6 people sitting around the table, and everything was ready, and I popped the USB stick into the computer, and I literally started, right? And I launched into this presentation now. Remember the word that I launched into the presentation. So anyway, I'm ripping through this presentation literally like a high-speed bullet train, right? I'm flying through this thing, 1,000,000 words a minute. I was so nervous. It felt like I was in this like time warp. I didn't even know what I was doing, what I was saying. I was just on autopilot. So anyway, I'm ripping through this presentation, and finally I ran out of words and I ran out of slides. And as I said, I was just in this zone. I didn't even realise timing or nothing. And for the first time since I started the presentation, I looked at the people sitting around the table, and they looked absolutely shocked. I think I just frightened the life out of them. Anyway, the guy who took me into the room came over, he shook my hand, he thanked me for coming along, and he asked me to leave, literally. Anyway, so walked back to the car, everything was silent. It took about 2 minutes to get back to the car. So we're sitting in the car, and I looked at the clock on the dashboard, and it was 10:27. Now, please note, this was a 40-minute presentation that started at 10 o'clock, and I had finished the whole presentation, been asked to leave the office, and made it back to the car in under 30 minutes, right? I was in panic mode. I was like, oh shit, I have blown it. I'm thinking, I'm going to have to look for a new job, and all these things are running through my mind, and I was starting to panic. Inside I was thinking, oh no, I've really messed up. Anyway, my boss turns to me, and he looks at me, and he's sitting in the passenger seat, and he says, James, I've got 3 questions for you. Now my mind immediately defaults to the negative bias. I'm thinking, okay, here it goes. First question, do you have a CV and is it up to date? Second question, do you have your taxi fare home? So all this negativity is running around in my head, and I was just like, I thought I'm done. Anyway, he looked at me and he said, James, my first question is this. He says, James, what did you do right during that presentation? I'm thinking, what? What did you do right during the presentation? And I was like, whoa, I was kind of taken aback. I was like, what did I do right? What did I do right? What did I do right? I said, well, I'm not 100% positive, but I think I got the whole presentation, and I think I got it in the correct order. I was kind of like, oh, and he smiles at me, he says, James, it was masterful. You didn't miss a single word of that presentation. He says, it was a great job. Well done. He says, okay, James, my second question. What did you do wrong in there? Yeah, I'm thinking, what did I do wrong? What did I do wrong? He says, I think I might have rushed it a little bit. And I said, I had a little smile on my face. And he kind of started to shake his head, and he says, James, he says, rush, he says, you don't think you stopped for a breath. So I asked him, was there anything else that I did wrong, Alistair? What else did I do wrong? And he goes, yeah. He says, he kind of spat a little bit. I was like, oh man, did you notice that? And he says, it was really hard not to, James. And so we're starting to laugh about the things that didn't go to plan. He says, okay, James, he says, here's my third question. Catch this. What would you do differently next time when you run that presentation again? What would you do next time to be more effective and successful? So I started to literally list off all the things I would do different. I said, okay, I would slow down. I would stop and ask questions before I move on to the next slide. I would have some water next to me as a prop if I felt nervous or had a dry mouth. And he turns and says, you know what, James? He says, I know you will smash it next time. He says, because you have now taken the time to self-reflect. which is what great managers and leaders do for themselves and for others. Now, what I've come to realise over time, what that man taught me that day was one of the most valuable lessons of my life. Why? Because that man took a moment in my life and time when I was taking my own negative self-talk and internal feedback, and I was attaching it to my sense of self-worth. I was getting this real negative bias, right? And if he had not been there to ask me those 3 simple questions, what he showed me that day, that these 3 questions enabled me to take negative feedback away from my sense of self-worth and use it as a learning tool rather than a judgment weapon on myself. So he taught me to learn from what had went well, what didn't go so well, and what we could do better. Now, this is the habit of self-reflection in action. Those 3 simple questions I start to, every day I work for this man, he used to ask me these 3 questions. In fact, he asked me those 3 questions so often that I actually began to ask them of myself. And right then and there, he helped me build my self-esteem and made me understand the power and habit of self-reflection. These 3 questions are the single most powerful leadership tool that you will put in your leadership toolbox. And because with these 3 questions, we literally have the power to liberate an individual's self-esteem regardless of how they were raised, irrespective of how their parents communicated them between the ages of 2 and 7. It doesn't matter. You as a leader have the power to build someone's self-esteem just by taking those 3 simple questions and consistently asking them, what did went well, what didn't go so well, what can you do better? Always remember this: leaders ask great questions of themselves and others, and managers tell people what to do. By taking the time to ask these 3 simple questions will help you unshackle an individual's self-esteem and sense of self-confidence, adaptability, open-mindedness, and willingness to embrace change and feedback. There is no single leadership tool that you can put in your leadership toolbox that will have more of a significant impact and make more substantial difference for you and your team than this one right here, the habit of self-reflection. Now, for most people, if they ask themselves anything, they'll tend to focus on what they did wrong. That's what we call a judgment question. And when we ask a judgment question, we tend to focus on the negative and beat ourselves up. We start to reinforce that opposing belief. Then we make excuses and we try to rationalise why something didn't work. That's that negative bias taking over our mind. And this is a pattern that we repeat to ourselves over and over again throughout our lifetime, this negative bias, just beating ourselves up. So here's why the sequencing of these questions is so critical. The sequencing actually breaks the pattern of how we look at feedback. By starting out with what they did right, suddenly feedback isn't bad because we're starting out in a positive. What did they do right? It doesn't seem so bad. And the beautiful thing is there is always something positive. There is always something positive that they did right. Even if it was, the fact that they showed up to attend the meeting, there's always something positive that we can take from any situation in life, and that's the key. Now, I want you to catch this. Throughout our programme, Leading with Motivational Intelligence, particularly emphasises in that process of giving to help leaders raise their motivational intelligence levels and self-reflection and literally foster a growth mindset within our team. An increasing body of evidence shows a direct correlation between motivational intelligence and human performance, particularly in the time of rapid change. It's more important now than ever before.